Downtown traffic in Seoul seems to be back to normal. It was pretty slow during the COVID-19 and seems to be completely back to normal. But the situation here, COVID-19 situation, I don't think it is that optimistic. It is heading to, I think, a fourth explosion. I don't know the situation at Irkutsk or Minsk back to Russia, but Seoul COVID-19 situation doesn't seem to be getting better. But people are so impatient, and they are just coming out. And I was coming from downtown meeting, and I was caught by the heavy traffic. Sorry about being late. Okay, so we will turn to 공유를 먼저 눌러야 되냐?
네.
여기 어디 있지? 위에가 나왔지? 초록색이지. 그리고
차이나가
이거지?
네. 오늘 25페이지부터.
Right. We stopped last time China kind of modern theory, modern history, Chinese history. The Great Famine occurred in 1959 and 61, was the result of both food availability decline and entitlement failure. The decline of food availability was triggered by the collapse of grain output, which was caused by mainly policy errors rather than bad weather. You may remember last week we were covering sort of collective farming in China. I think a collective farming experience in China was much less developed than in Russia. In Russia, the history of collective farm went back so many years, but China was basically private ownership in terms of farming, private peasants. And therefore, they were not used to collective farming, the collective farming. And therefore, probably by this main policy errors, there was a collapse of grain output. In an attempt to speed up both industrialization and socialization, unrealistic agricultural and industrial output targets had been set. Too much sort of high expectation goals, targets had been set. But those targets were not met, were not materialized. To achieve these targets, huge amounts of rural labor had been diverted from agriculture to unsound rural irrigation, steel making, and other rural industrial projects. In other words, some rural labor was misplaced and wasted to some extent. Okay. So the entitlement failure of the rural population was caused by the inequitable distribution policy of staple foods. For a while, the urban populace was guaranteed its food grain ration. The rural comrades were not guaranteed its food, grain ration. So rural cadres, for fear of being attacked as rightists, tended to inflate local output targets, which necessarily led to a higher effective procurement ratio, despite declining grain output. So as a result, after the fulfillment of the procurement quota, very little was left in the hands of the farmers to feed themselves, let alone for sowing and feeding their livestock. So this shows the cause of the Great Famine in China in late 1950s, early 1960s. So this experience was not met by Soviet Union. Soviet Union, of course, the farming business and in farming industry, agricultural industry, did not make that much improvement, but still they could support their population. But in case of China, they could not support their population. That's the problem right there. So for example, this is state grain balance sheet from 1957 to 1962. Husked grain in million tons, and you can check their supply and share of industries data. Also, national per capita food grain availability. 1957, 1962, best grain in million metric tons. So, for example, grain year, population, output, net exports, loss. Please remember, column 4, if you see this column 4, net export becomes negative. What does that mean? Their export was less than their import. Okay. Became very serious problem. So the Great Famine problem is indicated by rainfall devaluation indicator. So this is kind of a very bad year. In terms of rainfall, also very bad timing. Temperature deviation indices. In other words, temperature deviation is very volatile to some extent. So weather and temperature did not help out Great Famine in China. Official statistics of population and death rates. For example, population kept increasing. Rural death rate at one point, look at this statistic, believe it or not, in 1960, it was kind of rural death rate hitting almost 30%. Urban death rate hitting about 14%. And national death rate hitting 25%. This is Great Famine. Probably 2 weeks from now, we will take a look at North Korean case. And North Korea falls into this type of Great Famine in the middle of 1960s, after Soviet Union aid and the Chinese aid became over, finished. North Korea could not support their population by their harvest. And they came into similar situation like Great Famine. And I will show you, the data maybe 2 weeks after from today, okay? So this situation is really critical situation for the socialist economy of China. Per capita food grain availability in China cities, you can see that urban population was kept increasing to some extent. State grain sales to cities went down from 1959 to 1961. So urban per capita grain availability got deteriorated very rapidly from 1958 to 1961-62, almost like 40%, 30% decline. Okay. Rural per capita food grain availability, for example, against this rural population, grain output, procurement, resale to rural areas, total food grain availability, and rural per capita food grain availability. And that sharply declined during 1959, 1960. Okay. Various other net procurement rate of agricultural output in the grain availability. And you can see this also toward sharply downward trend from 1959 to 1962. Nominal and effective procurement ratio in Shandong province. For example, nominal procurement ratio means how much are purchased to support their production activity, for example. And from 1958 to 1960, procurement ratio declined. And actual procurement ratio is further declined from 21.5% to 18.8%. Now comes Cultural Revolution. So the failure, the origin of this Cultural Revolution, you should pay attention to that. What caused Cultural Revolution in China? The origin of the Cultural Revolution rests on the failure of food availability. In other words, both urban area and rural area could not support themselves in terms of food availability. So, the people, average people, were blaming government, blaming socialism. In our entire history of China, we never had a famine. Chinese people may have said, we never had thousands of years. We never had a famine. Now we have famine. What caused this famine? Collective farming and socialism, central planning, and kept blaming, the government and Mao himself. So Mao staged Cultural Revolution to probably rescue his mission toward socialism. In other words, in the first phase of Cultural Revolution, Red Guards were formed with the children of cadres and used to attack traditional Chinese culture and prominent cultural figures. So they had to have some enemies to stage a cultural revolution, and they took prominent cultural figures as enemies. During the second phase of Cultural Revolution, new groups of red guards known as rebel groups were formed, and their target was not traditional Chinese culture and its bearers, but party officials branded as capitalist rulers. In other words, to have some enemy, someone to blame for, they thought that party officials and established people, establishment, cultural figures, prominent cultural figures, things like that, these people were branded as capitalist rulers. And to conceal their economic failure, their political system, could not support economic activity. So to avoid that blame, they needed to pick up some capitalist rulers. And that's what happened during the Cultural Revolution. As more rebel groups were formed, the country in the third phase of the Cultural Revolution descended into something resembling civil war with factional fighting between rightists and leftists. Please remember this period, early 1960s, Soviet Union had no problem. Soviet Union was making real progress under their central planning model and made a great deal of industrialization effort. And also their collective farms at least could support themselves. But just totally different thing was happening in China. So Chinese route toward socialism was taking totally different path than the Soviet Union's, for example, path toward socialism. Of course, Soviet Union, as you have read Krugman, late 1960s, early 1970s, once industrialization is completed, then they fell into declining rates of return. Too much factories, too much road construction, too much buildings. But the market was not supporting Soviet Union's production activity. Soviet economy was pretty much closed economy. Of course, there was some trade between Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc, Eastern European countries. But Eastern European countries were not doing very well. Therefore, the trade benefit accrued to Soviet Union became very limited. And therefore, Soviet Union did not have create new market. If you do not have new market, what do you have? Production is supposed to meet with declining rates of return, diminishing returns. In other words, as Krugman indicated, there is a situation coming into Soviet Union that, okay, there are so much factories, so much roads, so much buildings, so much commercial factories, commercial outlet were constructed. But for what? The market was very self-limited, and therefore there is a declining rates of return. But in case of China, It's a little bit totally different to some extent. As more rebel groups were formed, the country in the third phase of the Cultural Revolution descended into something resembling civil war, with factional fighting between rightists and leftists. See, this is economic trouble is transcended into political trouble. So under Mao, Cultural Revolution created a lot of political fight. During the Cultural Revolution, Mao rolled back most of the more pragmatic policies that had been adopted after the failure of the Great Leap Forward movement. So Mao's radical policies were reinstated in agriculture. The practice of 3 freedoms and 1 guarantee was denounced, and the responsibility farm system was banned again. So the Cultural Revolution continued in the sense that ownership of the means of production and income distribution decisions were again shifted to a higher collective level, to the party, basically, with the transfer of the basic accounting unit back to the level of the production brigade. So in order to speed up industrial development, the transfer of resources to the agricultural sector was drastically cut back, and rural industries were made to rely once again on local resources and self-financed. Labor was again mobilized for the construction of rural infrastructure and irrigation projects, and moral incentives were emphasized again. So the Cultural Revolution, self-sufficiency in grain production and capital accumulation was pushed within the communes. The promotion of the principle of self-reliance, which essentially implies the establishment of a comprehensive, independent economic system, not only in the nation, but at the regional and local levels as well, even down to that of commune and the individual enterprise. But this is a totally outside the trend, opposite to the trend of socialist development or capitalist development. Self-reliance, commune system is totally non-modern. It's not modern economic system. I do not mean that the modern should be capitalist system. It's neither capitalist system nor socialist system. So this policy had disastrous consequences for economic growth because it totally neglected the basic economic principles of comparative advantage, namely specialization and economies of scale. In other words, comparative advantage is what? China must have some comparative advantageous sectors in farming or in raw material supply, in some primitive industrializing sector, but they did not engage in foreign trade. So they lost comparative advantage. They did not specialize. They ignored economies of scale. What is economies of scale? The larger, the better. Economies of scale means as scale becomes larger, cost goes down. Now, China did not engage in foreign trade, did not join the club of foreign trade. So their economies of scale was self-limited. So this is the scene, Cultural Revolution in front of Tsinghua University main gate. Now, I have been to this area about, I think, 2 or 3 years ago as Asia Clem's chairman. We had Asia Clem's annual meeting, productivity meeting, and Tsinghua University was the hosting institution. Now it is this street is occupied all the high-tech firms, venture firms and engineering schools, full of students, very lively scene. But during Cultural Revolution, Tsinghua University main gate was the target of destruction. Okay. So socialist modern economic growth, the outcome, we can reflect on the outcome of socialist modern economic growth. They aimed at rapid industrialization, modern economic growth, standard of living growth failed to match the growth of GDP, human development, income inequality, and stratification, all these seem to have failed. So, the outcome of 3 decades of socialist modernization under Mao was at least mixed. Economic change was impressive, for in this period, China achieved rapid industrialization, started modern economic growth. But when we say the evaluation is mixed, as you have seen, there was a famine, there was a lack of industrial development, there was a lack of specialization, there was a lack of, for example, economies of scale. So when we say the outcome of 3 decades of socialist modernization under Mao was mixed, we have to be careful in the word mixed. That is, somewhat positive evaluation is they did not give up socialism. Thus, politically, they were stable to some extent, repressive but stable. It was not before Mao. When Mao united China, before Mao united China, there was always a struggle between Communist Party, Chiang Kai-shek, and Mao-led Communist Party, and Nationalist Party, Kuomintang. But that was over. So to some extent, Mao gets credit in terms of political grip, political power holding. But their economic policy was total failure. So that's what we mean by the outcome of 3 decades of socialist modernization under Mao was mixed. Politically, at least stable, but economically not stable. Economic change was impressive, for in this period, China achieved rapid industrialization, started modern economic growth, but again, they fell into the trap of famine, and they did not maintain good system of modern market system. So Cultural Revolution ruined any effort for industrialization and economic growth. But these results were achieved at an enormous loss of human lives and output. A whole generation of China's Cultural Revolution and rural population was sacrificed and driven to achieve ever higher production outputs without being given adequate resources, inputs, or material rewards. Their standard of living suffered badly, and they were trapped in poverty and malnourishment. The results of Mao's social change agenda were equally mixed. On the one hand, China achieved excellent results in terms of human development with a dramatic rise in population's longevity and literacy. On the other hand, Mao failed to create an egalitarian society. Though he succeeded in keeping the interpersonal income inequality in both rural and urban sectors low, he failed to narrow the urban-rural income gap. Still, modern China, even at the present day, are suffering from the urban-rural income gap. For example, the China in the coastal cities, Guangdong area, Sichuan area, and that east coastal area, China per capita income is more than double the inland residents Chinese income. So rural urban income gap is still ongoing even at the present time, very serious social issue for China. Socialist modern economic growth, and though he dismantled the traditional class structure successfully, the stratification in socialist China was no less pronounced and rigid than it had been before. Vertical mobility was impossible for most people, even though it theoretically depended on little more than redness, that is, party loyalty. You may remember in my lecture on Korea's modernization, we were comparing vertical mobility among China, Korea, and Japan. And you may some of you may remember that I was reading that Mason et al.'s book, and we were reading that China was most open, vertical mobility. Japan was most closed. Korea was in between, semi-mobile like China, but semi-non-mobile like Japan. In other words, Japan's class structure, samurai group, peasant group, commoners, very strict. They had a very little vertical mobility. On the other hand, China, you could take national examination twice or three times, and if you pass that national examination to be a official server in the government, then you can move on. Your vertical mobility was pretty much open in China. So this is very ironical. So under socialism, vertical mobility was impossible for most people. This is a very ironical situation. Since the major distribution mechanism was not the market, but worked through the allocation of rewards and privileges by work units and party cadres, it was clearly defined and strictly controlled by institutions. So distribution mechanism was institutionalized, very rigid. Only party cadres enjoyed favorable distribution mechanism. The opportunity structure for education was virtually frozen in their ran through the Dunway and household registration system. Whatever opportunities for improving one's life chances were available were allocated in small increments with great ideological fanfare. Thus, while the stratification was less visible in Maoist China, it was definitely more pronounced and rigid. Please pay attention to the word rigid, that it had been before. And in substance, it was more akin to that of Tokugawa Japan than to a modern socialist society. I just mentioned about it. Tokugawa Japan was very strict, rigid social system. Okay. So international comparison of China's share of manufacturing in GDP. Share of manufacturing in GDP in 1981 China. So after Cultural Revolution, I think near to the year of Deng's power grip, Deng took it over power struggle. And this is about when Deng began his liberalization program. India was about this year only 18.1%. Predicted value for large owner income countries, lower income countries, 13%. Upper middle income countries, 25%. So we could say that China was at the roughly upper middle income countries' share of manufacturing in GDP, about 25%. Okay, that's World Bank's estimate. Share of heavy and machinery industry in GDP, dominantly bigger in China. So in other words, China's industrialization under Mao through Cultural Revolution, still very much heavy and machinery industry based, like Soviet Union. Relative to India, Indonesia, South Korea, the share of heavy and machinery industry in GDP was dominantly very high. For example, machinery 10.58%, heavy industry 16.4%. So almost at the level of Japan's heavy industry percentage, 20.4% in 1965 and 11.7% at the peak period of Japanese industrialization. Okay. So socialist modern economic growth, the outcome in terms of estimates of China's economic growth rates, official statistics between this period. In other words, this is under Mao, basically, before Deng's liberalization program was pushed. Official statistics, 6.1%. Medicine, he has 4.4%. Perkins and Rowski, 4.4%. So believe it or not, roughly 4.4% seems to be the right estimate. Okay. Growth of China's GDP and GDP per capita back from 1890 to 1978. Of course, after socialist revolution, China GDP growth rate, per capita GDP growth rate, it seems to be numerically very impressive, much better than old pre-modern China before 1952. Per capita GDP was almost zero growth rate during half century before 1952. Comparative growth rates of GDP per capita, China versus East Asian countries. You know this story now, but a lot better after reading Krugman, Young, and Lucas' paper. These four tigers, four little dragons, what they call four tigers, whatever, China is falling behind these tigers, falling behind Japan and Asian four little dragons. China was made some impressive growth compared to before 1952 period, but relatively international comparison wise, they were falling behind. Okay, so sources of growth, China before Deng's liberalization program, for example, let us take a look at this period only, 52-78, 4%, 4.4% is GDP growth rate, fixed capital growth rate, education enhanced labor growth rate, TFP. Now you know what is this meaning. TFP, now you understand what is TFP. Total factor productivity, overall efficiency of the economy. Look at overall efficiency of the economy, either mildly negative or insignificant, 0.5%. That means during even 1952, 1978, China's growth was basically fixed capital and labor input-led growth. Very little efficiency growth in TFP. Okay. So your learning of the Korean economy, macroeconomic terms, and growth accounting helps your understanding of reading Chinese economy. So that's why I began my lecture starting from Korean case, and then we can move to China or Japan case very easily, right? For example, income inequality in China and South Asia, Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient is measure of inequality. The higher this Gini coefficient, more unequal the income. So if you see that urban households and rural households, all households, first take a look at all households, right? And India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, for example, China is 0.330, South Asia 0.345. Of course, China seems a little bit better than all households in all households in South Asia, but not much better, very little. How about rural side? Rural side, China is a little bit better than South Asia. But how about urban household? China is a lot better than South Asia. That means this is the consequence of urbanization, industrialization in China. More workers were paid better earning by working in factory, in cities. So as lower income class becomes more earning power, have more earning power, this inequality becomes a lot less than Southeast Asia, South Asia. Okay. So this is a very interesting statistics. For example, categories of Chinese workers, urban permanent worker in state enterprises, dominant, roughly 38%. Urban workers in collective enterprises, 20%. Together, roughly about 60%, right? So urban temporary workers, rural temporary workers, rural workers in collective enterprises, basically farming, about roughly 27%. This shows Mao with Kissinger, initiating sort of a dialogue between China and the United States. And political liberalization. Mao's death in 1976, intense succession crisis occurred. Gang of Four, headed by Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, legacy of Cultural Revolution, right-wing reformers led by Deng Xiaoping, the restorationists led by Hua Guofeng, arrested Gang of Four, launched Great Leap Outward with 10-year plan. So Deng Xiaoping, third plenum meetings of the Central Committee of the CCP, China's Communist Party, in December 1978, economic modernization by pragmatic reform and open door policy. So I don't know whether this is the true story or not, but there was an episode at the time, about this time, 1978, Deng asked his subordinates, how many engineers do we need to really reconstruct socialist economy? And the subordinates of Deng reported that, sir, we need at least 10,000 very eligible engineers in farm engineering, in pharmaceutical engineering, in heavy chemical engineering, in rocket engineering, everywhere. We need good engineers. So Deng asked his subordinates, if we need 10,000, okay, how about sending 20,000 students abroad, particularly to America, to get good education and come back? And his subordinates reported that only 10% is coming back, sir. They are not coming back to mainland China because income in mainland China is not good enough. So they try to survive in the United States, or they go to Europe or somewhere else. they are not returning. Only 1% out of 10 are returning to mainland China. That's his subordinate's report. Then Deng said, okay, then send 100,000 people, 100,000 students. If only 10% comes back, you said 10,000 people are needed, 10,000 engineers are needed, then send 100,000 students. It's not your money, it's government money, scholarship. So let us send 100,000 people to US and European countries to get engineering degree. And at least 10,000 will be returned. But this is kind of episode that is repeatedly has been told in news media. And what had happened, those students are right now at the present time forming basic engineer group in modern China. And in fact, more than 10% returned. Recently, more than 50% are returning to China. So those people who are beneficiaries of Deng's bold education plan, education strategy, engineering education beneficiaries formed modern China. And they could catch up in terms of technology. They could catch up South Korea. They could catch up Japan. They could catch up United States. They could catch up Soviet Union. So China's long march towards a market economy, first stage from 1979 to 1984, low-key and restricted reforms. Deng and Zhao Jiang were restricted by party elders. But second stage, market as a dominant mechanism, the rise of non-state enterprise and introduction of dual pricing system, but set back by June 1989, Tiananmen Square incident to remember Hu Yaobang's death. To my just judgment, of course, Tiananmen Square incident is a very tragic incident, but it was somewhat inevitable for China, for modern China, because to hold on to the power, political stability. Suppose this happened to the opposite direction. Suppose Tiananmen Square was not suppressed, and there were riots, demonstration after demonstration, all across China, there could be demonstration and incidents, and large-scale turmoil, political instability must have followed. So this is, again, it's like, the Tiananmen Square is a typical, like a symbol of what you learned, Lipset phenomena. China after liberalization, 1989, by 1989, economic progress was rewarded. So everyone wanted more political freedom. So Tiananmen Square can be symbol of Lipset phenomena you learned. But to my judgment, personal judgment, even though a lot of Chinese people lost freedom, but to make socialist system stable one, it was inevitable incident for Chinese authorities to hold on to the power, to keep peaceful stability, political stability. China is just too large, and China has experienced that many kingdoms, little kingdoms, fighting against each other. We call three nation story, and also there are Song dynasty and Ming dynasty, all struggled through different factions of the regional conflict. And modern China, socialist party knew about this. Once we allow this freedom, we cannot maintain peace. We cannot maintain political stability. So they had to use military power to stabilize the incident. The third stage, after 1992, Deng's southern tour in 1992, calling for opening to the West and deepening reforms. And you know all these stories. Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji pushed reform movement, passing away old Conservative Party leaders and collapse of communism in late 1980s. So China was finding its own way of reconstructing socialism, and the socialism with the market economy. Okay. So China's reform after Deng, 14th Party Congress in 1993, formally cast off planned economy, adopted a comprehensive reform program, phased out material balance planning and dual price system in 1993. The average tariff rate was 38.4%, reduced to 7.3% in 1992, admitted ultimately to WTO in 2001. Being admitted to WTO means China can trade freely with the rest of the world. That means China can specialize in their own production. China can make use of scale economies. That's exactly what happened. United States, if you go to the market, full of Chinese garments, Chinese foods. So that's why currently China is engaged in trade war with the United States, because they're economies of scale. What is economies of scale? The more you make, the cheaper you can make. So all Chinese goods, toys, garments, even now, electric machines, mobile phones, you name it. Everything is made by China. Why? Because China can make better use of economies of scale. Okay, so this is a comparison of China's and other Asian NICs growth rates in their period of modern economic growth. China is outpacing Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong, all as a consequence of Deng's liberalization program. China experimented socialism within market system. During this period, China was more open to outside world than Soviet Union was. Okay, China's and its Asian neighbors' GDP per capita as percent that of US in 1952 is usually we use US as a benchmarking nation. Japan was about 22%, South Korea about 7%, China was about 5% back in 1952. You know this story. Lucas' article mentioned about Korea versus Philippines. By that time, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan was much ahead of South Korea. Okay, sources of China's economic growth, 1978 to 2008. You can see this OECD record, for example. Growth of capital, contribution of labor, and TFP, efficiency. Very large from 1978 to 2008. In other words, Chinese growth was not resting on capital growth or labor growth. They made a lot of efficiency gain. Now, this is OECD estimate, Perkins and Rauski's estimate, similar, pretty high. Okay. Contribution to GDP growth, agriculture, industry. Now, 2008, agriculture occupies only 6.5%, over 50% industry, service about 43%. So China transformed itself into modern nation, modern industrializing nation. Projection of China's growth of per capita income, 2005 to 2030. Projected rate of growth, China 6.4%, US, Japan, much less impressive. 2030s per capita projected GDP. China is almost half of US. Japan, a little bit behind Japan. Okay. So China's One Belt, One Road policy initiative. 2013 APEC meeting announced to restore the ancient Silk Road and Silk Road economic belt and 21st century maritime Silk Road. So we call this is a one belt economic belt strategy. And under the name of coordinating development policies, forging infrastructure and facilities network, strengthening investment and trade relations, enhancing financial cooperations, deepening social and cultural exchanges. So China has two goals. They need to develop inland, remote area, Xinjiang area, or central Chinese area. Central China's area have been less developed. So to develop those areas, they wanted to create Silk Road economic belt and Century Maritime Silk Road to embrace for their inland development. On the other hand, 유진아, 내가 여기다 쓸 수 있냐?
네, 지금 쓰실 수 있어요.
쓰면 될 수 있어?
네.
Recently, U.S. is creating in against this Silk Road economic belt and Century Maritime Silk Road belt. U.S. is creating Quad. Okay. And that embracing US, Australia, Japan, and India. They want to circle China and put political pressure as well as economic pressure. It's a bandage effect. And currently, South Korea is in tension with the United States and China. Because for South Korea, China is too important market, too big market to forget about. So South Korea is squeezed between US and China. So South Korea cannot get into the sort of immediately join Quad. Then they will be sort of penalized by China in terms of their trade. South Korea is selling a lot of semiconductor to China, a lot of engineering goods, a lot of cars to China. So it's very delicate position. That's a very open and serious issue in South Korea right now. That originally came from China's idea of one belt, one road, 일대일로. One belt, one road means, okay, let me see. Some of you may be able to read the Chinese character. 네. Belt, meaning it's a belt. I'm trying to find, okay. Okay, I'm pretty good, huh? What do you think? 일. Okay, in Chinese, one. 로. Okay. Okay, I got it. I got it in Chinese. So it's virtually one belt, one road in Chinese character. Okay? So that's 일대일로 policy, one belt, one road policy. And the US policy, Quad policy. So South Korea is squeezed between US and China. So I recently contributed a column on Digital Times about this dilemma South Korea is facing with. Okay. So overall initiative of 6 economic corridors spans over 78 countries. So overall means basically open door policy. All right. And the new Eurasian land bridge, China, Mongolia, Russia corridor, China, Central Asia, West Asia corridor, China, Indochina Peninsula corridor, China, Pakistan corridor, Bangladesh, China, Indian, Myanmar corridor. All these are anticipated sort of one belt, one road policy. I hope Russia can benefit. Soviet Union can benefit from Chinese effort, for Chinese strategy to encircle Russia. At least Russia's inland area can benefit from this development. Railroad, new railroad system, and so forth. Reactions. Western reactions mixed. Malaysia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka welcomed one belt, one road policy. Vietnam, India, doubts. Russia as a way of funding assistance. Europe, one belt, one road, possible integration with 315 billion euro investment plan, Juncker plan, and Eastern Europe plan, Czech Republic, Serbia, and Poland, expecting major financial inputs. China-US trade war. As you have seen, China-US trade war in 2018, Trump set tariffs and other trade barriers on China, unfair trade practices blamed, and 2-year trade war continued to exist, right? Trump and Vice President Liu signed the Phase 1 trade deal in January 2020. The coronavirus could upend Trump's US-China trade deal. Stalled trade, depressed consumer demand in China could disrupt its implementation. China is to buy $200 billion worth of US energy and agricultural products. Despite trade war, China is the US largest trade partner for nearly $750 billion in trade alone in 2018. And here we go. I did not update with the new government of US, but the new government is not friendly with China. So we'll have to wait and see. Okay, so I will stop here for today's lecture. Maybe next week, we will get into Japanese modernization and Japanese economic history very briefly, okay? So let me stop here for today. Okay, any chatting? 어디로 가야지?
공유 중지를.
공유 중지를 하고, 그지? Okay, any question? We concluded almost modernization in China. And if you have any question, please raise questions.
I have a question, if you may. Evgeny teaches.
Evgeny, you have
Yes.
question?
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
보이스가 작동하지 끄지 않았지. 채팅 할까? 채팅? 내가 채팅으로 보내지. 채팅이 어디 안 나오니?
그 채팅 누르신 다음에 입력하시면
여기 입력하면 되지.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry, I have some technical problems. So I have a question. All we know, we all talked about Kuznets and Lucas human capital development models. According to our research, Eurasian Economic Club of Scientists, in China, the urban-rural gap is